The body of 35-year-old Sergio Sanchez was found here behind me.
He is calmly, methodically hunting and killing people.
With one arm on the steering wheel and one arm sitting like this with a revolver just pointing at me.
And I felt wet, like drenched. And I looked down and it was blood.
The dog shooting didn't make any sense.
A serial killer does not step into the world looking like a threat. He does not carry something that makes people immediately turn around and walk the other way. He does not announce what he is, and that is exactly what makes him so dangerous, because he becomes invisible in plain sight. He blends in perfectly. He moves through the same streets, sits in the same traffic, waits at the same red lights as everyone else. Who was the serial shooter terrorizing the San Fernando Valley in 2014? And what made his attacks especially frightening? And in 2014, across Los Angeles, that invisible danger had a name: Alexander Hernandez, a man who would spend months driving through the San Fernando Valley, selecting victims at random, turning completely ordinary moments into scenes of sudden violence. And what made everything even more disturbing was not just the brutality of what he did, but the complete absence of meaning behind it. There was no clear motive, no personal connection, no argument, no warning, just a decision made in seconds that would end someone's life forever. And that kind of randomness creates a very different kind of fear, because if there is no reason, then there is no way to predict it, no way to avoid it, no way to see it coming. It started in the early hours of March 14th, 2014, just after 1 in the morning, when the city was quiet and the roads were nearly empty. The kind of silence that makes everything feel calm, almost safe, when a man named Sergio Sanchez was driving home from work. Something routine, something normal, something he had done many times before. And behind him, another vehicle appeared. At first, just headlights far in the distance. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would immediately draw attention. But slowly that distance began to close. The vehicle stayed behind him, matching his speed, following him in a way that at first might not have seemed threatening, but gradually created a subtle sense of unease. Something difficult to explain. Something that sits quietly in the back of your mind. And then suddenly, everything changed. Gunfire. Loud, sudden, violent. The shots cut through the silence of the night, and in that moment, everything became instinct. The driver pressed the accelerator, trying to escape, trying to create distance, trying to survive without fully understanding what was happening. But the bullets kept coming, striking his vehicle, turning the freeway into a moving crime scene. And investigators would later determine that the shooting did not happen where his car was eventually found, meaning he had been chased, hunted along the road before finally losing control. And that detail alone changed everything.
Sergio Sanchez was found here behind me in his car.
Because it showed intent, it showed persistence, it showed that this was not a random outburst, but something deliberate, something controlled, something carried out with purpose, even if that purpose made no sense. When authorities arrived, the scene raised more questions than answers. What happened to Sergio Sanchez during the first major shooting incident? There was no shattered glass at the location, no clear sign that the shooting had taken place there, and it became clear that the victim had been trying to escape, that he had been alive during that drive, that he had been fighting for survival in those final moments. And yet, there was nothing to indicate why he had been chosen. No connection, no history, no reason. And that absence of reason would become the defining element of everything that followed. At first, it was treated as a single case, a tragic but isolated incident, something that happens in a city as large as Los Angeles. And that assumption allowed what came next to unfold without immediate recognition, because only days later another driver was targeted, followed in the same way, a vehicle staying behind him, matching his movements, and then without warning opening fire. And this time the victim survived, injured but alive. able to describe what had happened. The fear, the confusion, the realization that he had been attacked for no reason at all. And when investigators looked at both cases side by side, there were similarities, but not enough yet to confirm a pattern. Not enough yet to say with certainty that they were dealing with the same person. And that delay, that gap in understanding, gave the attacker more time. Weeks passed, and life in Los Angeles continued as normal. People drove to work, sat in traffic, stopped at lights, completely unaware that someone was out there, moving through the same streets, watching, selecting, deciding, and during that time, the attacks continued, scattered across different areas of the San Fernando Valley, different neighborhoods, different times of day and night, each one handled by different divisions, each one investigated separately. And because of that, the pattern remained hidden longer than it should have. And during that time, Alexander Hernandez continued doing exactly what he had been doing, driving, watching, choosing them, observing them, almost as if he was deciding. And that detail adds another layer to the story, because it suggests something more than randomness. It suggests a process, a moment of selection, a decision point where someone becomes the target, not because of who they are, but simply because they are there. And that kind of randomness combined with that kind of control makes the situation even more disturbing. Then came May, and with it one of the most intense moments of the entire case. A 19-year-old young man named Julian Archer driving home after prom. A night that should have been filled with good memories, laughter, celebration, and around 4 in the morning he stopped at a red light in a quiet neighborhood. The streets empty, the surroundings calm, the kind of moment where nothing feels dangerous simply because nothing ever has been. And then he noticed headlights behind him. At first, nothing unusual, just another car. But something felt off, something small, something he could not explain, and so he looked into his rearview mirror. And what he saw changed everything. A man sitting calmly behind the wheel, one arm resting casually on the steering wheel, the other holding a gun already pointed directly at him. No hesitation, no warning, no emotion, just a decision already made.
With one arm on the steering wheel and one arm sitting like this with a revolver just pointing at me.
The shots came instantly. Bullets tore through the car, shattering glass, ripping through metal, striking his body multiple times within seconds. The sound overwhelming, the impact immediate, the pain impossible to process in a clear way, everything collapsing into chaos. And yet somehow, through instinct alone, he managed to reach for his phone, call emergency services, his voice weak, breaking, barely holding together as he said he had been shot. And then everything went silent as he lost consciousness.
I've been shot. Okay, I'm on Mayo and Corbin.
His car rolled forward slowly, drifting without control until it came to a stop. And by the time emergency responders arrived, he had lost an enormous amount of blood, far more than most people could survive. How did Julian Archer survive the attack after prom? And what lasting effects did the shooting have on him? And doctors would later say there was no logical reason he should have lived. He required massive transfusions, multiple surgeries, his injuries severe and life-threatening, and for a long time he was completely paralyzed, his body unable to respond, his future uncertain. And yet he survived, but survival came at a cost. A long recovery, constant pain, permanent damage, a life changed forever by a moment that lasted only seconds, a moment that had no reason behind it, no explanation, no warning. And while he was fighting to stay alive, the attacks continued. While Julian Archer was fighting for his life in a hospital bed, his body held together by surgeries, transfusions, and sheer will to survive, the person responsible for that moment was still out there, still moving through the same streets, still sitting in traffic like nothing had happened. And that is what made the situation so dangerous, because there was no pause, no hesitation, no sign that the violence would stop. Instead, it continued quietly at first, almost hidden within the normal flow of daily life, and investigators still had not fully connected the cases. Different divisions were handling different shootings, each one focused on its own incident, unaware that they were dealing with the same individual. And during that time, Alexander Hernandez adapted. He changed vehicles, he changed weapons, he changed small details in his approach, but the core behavior remained exactly the same. He followed, he selected, he attacked, and he disappeared. That pattern repeated itself again and again, and one of the most unsettling aspects of the case was the simplicity of it. There was no elaborate plan, no complex setup, no long preparation, just a moment of attention, a decision, and then violence. And that simplicity made it harder to detect, because it did not follow the kind of structure investigators are trained to look for. It was unpredictable, inconsistent on the surface, but deeply consistent underneath. At one point, he used a different weapon entirely, something that looked like it belonged to another time. A black powder revolver, an old-style firearm that required manual reloading after each shot. Something unusual, something that did not immediately connect to the earlier shootings. And that detail alone delayed the investigation further, because now it seemed like multiple offenders could be involved. Multiple unrelated incidents happening across the same area, and that confusion gave him more space, more time. On Father's Day, a man was driving with his children, something completely normal, something safe, something that should never become dangerous. And he noticed a vehicle behind him that would not go away, switching lanes, trying to create distance, trying to understand what was happening, but the car stayed with him, following, watching, and eventually he pulled over, maybe thinking this was some kind of misunderstanding, maybe thinking he could resolve whatever was happening, and he approached the other driver, and in that moment everything changed, because instead of an explanation, he was met with a gun, raised calmly, pointed directly at him, and a shot fired without hesitation. He survived, but only because the weapon slowed the attacker down, only because reloading took time, only because he had seconds to react. And again, there was no reason, no argument, no connection, just another random moment that turned violent. As the months went on, the tension built quietly. Even if the public did not yet fully understand what was happening, investigators began to notice similarities, vehicles involved, patterns of following, victims inside cars, often alone, often caught in moments where they could not escape. And slowly the idea of a single offender began to form, but it was still incomplete, still uncertain, still missing the piece that would connect everything. And then came August. Everything changed in August. The pace increased, the violence escalated, the attacks became closer together, more aggressive, more visible, and within just a few days, multiple shootings occurred, creating a sense of urgency that had not existed before, and now it was impossible to ignore that something larger was happening. Early one morning, a woman was driving to work, something routine, something she had done many times before, and she noticed a vehicle without headlights, something unusual, something that stood out just enough to catch her attention, but not enough to make her stop, and she continued driving, eventually exiting the freeway, reaching an intersection where she slowed down, preparing to turn, and in that moment, everything happened at once. A sound, a sudden impact, then warmth. She looked down and saw blood. At first, it did not make sense. Then she looked to her side, and there it was, the same vehicle, the window down, a shotgun pointed directly at her.
I saw the shotgun barrel pointed at me, and I'm like, I don't know who this person is.
And in that moment, instinct took over. She accelerated immediately, turning, trying to get away, trying to survive, and more shots followed, loud, powerful, tearing through metal and glass. And somehow she managed to escape, despite being severely injured, despite losing blood, despite barely being able to think clearly. But what happened next made the moment even more surreal. In a state of shock, disoriented, confused, She approached the attacker's vehicle. She tried to speak. She tried to ask why. She tried to understand. And he said nothing. He just stared at her. Cold, empty, completely without emotion. That moment stayed with her. Not just the physical pain, not just the memory of the attack, but that stare, that complete absence of humanity. And that detail would later become one of the most important parts of the case because it showed something beyond violence. It showed detachment, a complete disconnect from what he was doing, from the people he was harming, from the consequences of his actions. And while she survived, others would not. After the shooting of the woman on her way to work, the situation reached a point where everything began to accelerate, not just in terms of the violence itself, but also in the way investigators started to piece things together, because now there were too many similarities to ignore, too many incidents happening too close together, too many victims with no connection to each other, and slowly the realization began to take hold that this was not a series of isolated events. This was something else entirely, something far more dangerous, something that had been unfolding for months without being fully recognized. And while law enforcement was starting to close in, the attacker was not slowing down. He was escalating. Within a very short period of time, multiple shootings occurred, back to back, almost as if something had changed, almost as if the restraint that had existed before was gone. And now the attacks were happening in rapid succession, one after another, leaving behind a trail of destruction that was impossible to ignore. And among those moments was one that captured the randomness of it all in the most disturbing way. A man sitting at a traffic light early in the morning, his lunch sitting beside him, something simple, something ordinary, something that represents routine, daily life, responsibility, and within seconds that moment was gone. His vehicle struck from behind by gunfire, bullets tearing through the car, ending his life before his day had even begun. And that detail stayed with investigators, not just because of the violence, but because of what it represented: a normal life interrupted without warning, without reason, without any chance to react. At another moment, a family driving together early in the morning became targets. Their vehicle approached, followed, and then attacked. The driver later describing how the man in the other vehicle looked directly at him and calmly spoke before opening fire. A detail that added something even more unsettling to the case because it suggested awareness, intention, a deliberate act carried out without emotion, without hesitation, as if it was just another decision, just another moment. And still there was no clear explanation, no motive, no connection, no reason. But while the violence was reaching its peak, the investigation was finally catching up. The breakthrough did not come from one of the major crime scenes. It did not come from the shootings that had taken lives. It came from something that at first seemed completely unrelated, an incident involving animals, a shooting that made no sense just like the others. But this time there were witnesses, people who had seen the man before, people who recognized him, people who had interacted with him, and most importantly, people who knew where he lived. And suddenly, after months of uncertainty, investigators had something concrete: a name, a face, a location.
In the same car, he told them his name was Alex and took them to his house.
Everything began to come together at once. Descriptions from previous victims, details about the vehicles, evidence collected from different scenes. All of it started to align. All of it pointed to one person. What clues eventually helped investigators connect the shootings and identify Alexander Hernandez as the suspect? Alexander Hernandez, a house in Silmar, was identified. Surveillance confirmed the vehicle, the same vehicle that had been seen in multiple attacks, the same vehicle that had left behind fragments at a crime scene, the same vehicle that witnesses had described again and again. And now it was sitting in one place. Detectives moved quickly. A search warrant was obtained. A tactical team was assembled. The house was surrounded. and inside was the man they had been looking for. He attempted to escape, but there was nowhere left to go. Within moments, he was taken into custody, and just like that, months of violence came to an end. Not with a dramatic confrontation, not with a final act of resistance, but with a sudden stop, a quiet capture that closed a chapter of fear that had stretched across an entire region. Inside the home, investigators found what they needed: weapons, a shotgun matching the one used in multiple attacks, a black powder revolver consistent with earlier shootings, ammunition, physical evidence that tied him directly to the crimes. And for the first time, everything made sense. The randomness, the escalation, the pattern hidden beneath the surface, all of it connected, all of it traced back to one person. In total, 5 people had been killed. Many others had been wounded, most of them attacked while sitting in their cars. Most of them completely unaware that they had been chosen. And even after the arrest, even after the evidence was collected, even after the case was built, one question remained. A question that investigators, prosecutors, and even experts would struggle to answer. Why? Why these people? Why these moments? Why this pattern? Years passed before the case finally went to trial. Delays, complications, and time stretching the process. But eventually the evidence was presented. The connections were made clear. The pattern was explained, and Alexander Hernandez was convicted of multiple counts of murder and attempted murder, sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never walk free again. But even then, even with a conviction, even with a sentence, the answer to that central question remained incomplete, because sometimes there is no explanation that feels sufficient.
When Alexander Hernandez is having a bad day, it makes him feel better to kill people.
Sometimes there is no reason that makes sense. And that is what makes this case so unsettling. Not just the violence, not just the number of victims, but the randomness. What sentence did Alexander Hernandez receive after being convicted? And why does the case remain so unsettling even after his capture? The idea that an ordinary moment sitting in your car, waiting at a red light, driving home after work, starting your day, can suddenly become something final, not because of something you did, not because of someone you knew, but simply because somewhere, at that exact moment, someone made a decision, a quiet decision, a sudden decision, a final decision, and you never saw it coming.